Hey everyone, this is Will and welcome to this brand new and exciting episode of The Missing Piece. If you follow the news closely, that for China, one of the largest economies in the world, that quickly wrap up one of the significant congressional meetings within 2 weeks. Now this time for China, not only they will understand the current President Xi Jinping is going to continue his presidency, but also during the opening and the closing ceremonies that Xi Jinping lay out specific strategies, not only about China, but also about this Chinese style or this Chinese initiatives for the whole world. But meanwhile, one of the neighboring countries, which is North Korea, it's also sending strong signals to the neighboring countries such as South Korea. How about this diplomatic relations when North Korea is threatening the country with nuclear weapons development? And how about the collaboration between South Korean government and the US? In this episode, we're going to address all of those key issues. Now, please allow me to welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Marc Lanteigne. Professor Marc teaches in political science, including international relations, comparative politics, including China, Asia Pacific, Oceania, and major countries around the world. Professor Marc, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Professor Marc, it has been a very busy week, again, as we mentioned before, for China. Now, we know that this year, that this congressional meeting is rather significant, not only for the country of China, but also it really sends strong messages around the world. Now, I want to start with the first question. How should we understand this common themes or this plan that laid out by Xi Jinping? I guess we can sum up quickly by three things. Number one is the modernization of China. And number two, this territorial dispute confirmation. And number three, the confirmation of his presidency for the upcoming future. How should we understand all of that?
Very good question. And there are many different dimensions that can be taken away from this meeting, both on the domestic and the international level. First of all, under normal circumstances, Xi Jinping would be stepping down now because it had been convention for the past 2 decades that a leader in China was to serve 2 5-year terms.
That's right.
That was done away with back in 2018. So that means that in theory, Xi Jinping can continue to rule indefinitely. Now, whether he chooses to do that is still a bit of an open question, but certainly it does suggest that the Chinese government is starting to move away from the whole idea of collective leadership, which was the standard in the 90s and the early aughts. Now, what else is happening is that this particular meeting had been put under a great deal of scrutiny to see what kind of policy changes might be undertaken both domestically and internationally. One issue which, as you point out, is omnipresent is the situation with Taiwan. Cross-strait relations are becoming much more difficult over the past few years. During the Party Congress, the idea that Taiwan is a part of China was brought up more than once. That there certainly was the underlining of the fact that the Taiwan issue is still quite prevalent in the Chinese government right now, and this is obviously of concern to Taipei and to the international community. And finally, there was a lot of question about the fact that Xi had been consolidating a great deal of his power over the past few years, that he has been very interested in appointing loyalists, including, for example, the most recent members of the Standing Committee, and that he was much more interested in putting his own personal stamp on Chinese leadership. He was confirmed, for example, as the core leader of China during this session. So many changes in a short time. It's been a very interesting week in Chinese politics all around.
Professor Marc, again, going back to how you answer the question, we know that even before this congressional meeting took place, that you and I, we had a similar conversation because we talk about the leadership style of Xi Jinping and also what could we expect regarding Xi Jinping's blueprint or even the bigger future for China. But at this moment, let's go back to the word modernization. Again, take a closer look. The Chinese economy is still in this slowness. And number two, some of the major cities are still battling against the pandemic. And number three, under this Belt and Road Initiative, if I want to be careful, that the promises that China lay out for some of the countries are not actually in place anymore. And quite frankly, some countries are beginning to question the intention of China. So how should we understand the word modernization within the speech? Does that mean that Xi Jinping is not only interested in consolidating his power within the people in China, but also he's trying to regain the confidence from other countries outside China? What do you think?
Yeah, well, what she has been trying to do is to stress to the Chinese people that on one hand, there is not going to be a let up in reform and opening up. So in other words, China is not going to pull inward in terms of its global economic interests. That said, as you correctly point out, China's economy is facing some very significant headwinds, not the least of which because of the ongoing zero COVID policy. The fact that whole cities have been locked down for long periods of time. I can point to Chengdu, Shanghai, Wuhan. And obviously, this is going to have a very significant impact on China's growth. And it is understandable that China's growth is slowing. I should point out, it is very telling that we have not received the third quarter GDP figures in China quite yet. And that was noticed quite a bit by China watchers. Now, internationally, there's also been quite a few changes. Even though the Xi government has insisted that the Belt and Road is on schedule, that it is going to continue, there have been significant slowdowns in progress with a lot of concerns in Africa, in Europe, in Southeast Asia, that a lot of the promises of Belt and Road projects have not been fulfilled. Add to that the concern about the economic situation between China and the United States. Two kind of catchphrases which have been bandied around quite a bit. One is decoupling, the idea that the United States and China would begin to kind of separate their economies, become less dependent on each other. And the second has been a catchphrase which has been floating around the Party Congress proceedings, and that is common prosperity, which is the idea that, okay, there needs to be a greater emphasis on redistributing the wealth to prevent too high extremes of wealth and poverty within the country. So certainly there's going to be a lot of questioning over whether this third term of Xi is going to see significant economic changes, because a lot of obstacles lie ahead for the country right now compared to 5 years ago.
Professor Mark, how much do you think that we can understand Xi's intention during his third term? Because again, going back to the point is we know that Xi Jinping is very much interested in continuing his presidency for the following 5 or 10 years, if however that long is. But also, meanwhile, that when we look at this Communist Party, on one hand, China is striving to get closer to this capitalistic system. But meanwhile, Xi Jinping cannot afford to abandon this deep-rooted communist belief. As a matter of fact, some people believe that even today is a possibility that Xi Jinping is trying to turn the page over, or so in other words, forget about the period of Mao. Forget about all the predecessors that everyone did before, because Xi Jinping today, after this confirmation for his third term, he's going to revolutionize China into the next level. So Mike, again, going back to the question is, how do you think that we are going to trust Xi is going to shoulder much greater responsibilities without losing his credibility?
Well, you just made the important phrase, shouldering responsibilities. Like, not for nothing is one of Xi's nicknames the Minister of Everything. And that means that he is going to need to take sole responsibility for the economy. Now, if, as is planned, the next premier is going to be Li Qiang, who is still somewhat inexperienced. He did not have any experience as being vice premier, which was another break in tradition. Pretty much any rise and fall of the Chinese economy will be Xi Jinping's responsibility. Now, go back about 10 years ago when Xi was first taking office. Debates about the degree to which the Chinese economy should be further liberalized, should be further marketized, were everywhere in the hallways of power. Now, there are many different ways to describe this, but the one I like the most is the whole idea of cake theory. Like, is the best way of bringing China forward is to bake a bigger cake, which was the idea of more moderates like Wang Yang, or is it better to simply take the existing cake and split it up more evenly? Now, Xi was trying to walk the line between these two extremes, but it would seem to suggest that he is leaning a little bit more towards the idea of redistribution of wealth. You saw that when he began to crack down on tech firms last year. You see this with the idea of common prosperity. So I would say that, yes, Xi is very much looking to the future, looking to continue the opening up process economically, internally, and internationally. But he is still tendency to reach backward to maybe not Maoist ideas, but maybe kind of new left ideas, saying that we should not abandon our communist socialist ideas.
Professor Marc, during the closing ceremony, for the first time that Xi Jinping brought the brand new team on for the new cabinet. Now, we know that by looking at the video or by looking at the picture that there are only a few familiar faces, but should I say, majority of the people are still rather new, not only to Chinese people, but also to a lot more international communities. Now, help us to understand, because you use the word royalist many times. Now, my first question is, by pledging the royalty to Xi or to this Communist Party, what do people get in return? That's the first one. And the second one is, why do you think that paying this royalty to Xi Jinping or following Xi Jinping closely, why is that so significant? Is that the simple reason because Xi would like to have close members as consultant or as political advisors, and so that his space won't be attacked or won't be easily removed by any other power whatsoever? What do you think?
Yeah, exactly. One area that was being looked at very closely when the new standing committee was announced was, okay, how old are the representatives? The youngest member of the new standing committee is 60 years old. Now, there's been a tradition in the upper echelons of the Chinese government. They refer to it as 7 up, 8 down. So if you're 67 years, you are still able to serve in the upper tier of the Chinese government. As soon as you hit 68, you are expected to retire. Now, that rule has been kind of shoved around a bit, but it was still considered a norm. Now, notice what happened here. 2 members of the previous standing committee, I mentioned Wang Yang, who was considered a moderate and an economic reformer, as well as the outgoing Premier Li Keqiang, they're both 67. So there was some suggestion that, okay, perhaps they could be retained in some capacity. And had they stayed on, it would have suggested that other factions were maintaining a certain amount of balancing. This did not happen. The standing committee now is almost completely made up of Xi loyalists. You have some leftovers from the previous committee, such as Wang Huning, who is known as the ideological czar. But many others are relatively new. The former mayor of Beijing, the former party head of Shanghai. So it would really seem to suggest that Xi is putting a great deal more focus on loyalty rather than actual acumen. Because some of these new members are also very inexperienced and will have a lot of work to do in a very short time to bring China's economy and kind of social situation back to rights very quickly. So this is why critics are really starting to get worried that one early casualty of this new government might be China's economic growth, at least in the short term.
Professor Marc, I want to go back to this territorial dispute, again, of course, which is actually the region of Taiwan. Now, we know that during the opening ceremony that Xi Jinping emphasized many times that regarding Taiwan, this is China's domestic issue and this is not an international concern. I think that sentence, if I'm not mistaken, he repeated several times, and not only that he want to make sure that Chinese people within China understand that there's going to be a power shift in Taiwan, and also there's going to be a confirmation from the side of Chinese Communist Party. But meanwhile, that message was also sent crystal clear overseas for other countries who are very interested in getting involved into the issue between China and Taiwan at this moment. So again, how should we understand about the future regarding this relationship between Taiwan and China? And do you think that by, again, having this confirmation from Xi Jinping, Taiwan should be worried at this moment, because it looks like Xi Jinping is not going to let go of this issue, and also Xi Jinping is going to hold firm about this one China policy. What do you think, Professor Marc?
Yes, another kind of split that we're seeing just over the past week is that previous governments in China had been obviously not soft on the issue of Taiwan, but were willing to kind of give a little bit more space, saying that, okay, this is a very serious issue, but it's not something that we are in a hurry to resolve as long as the status quo is not changed. We're definitely seeing a shift in that. And that was underscored over this past week, that Xi considers Taiwan to be a serious issue relating to both politics and security. There's still a bit of bad blood lingering from Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan a few months ago. There's the worry that this is going to be the start of a trend, that the United States is going to lead the charge to internationalize the Taiwan situation. And Xi is very interested in cutting off that process as quickly as possible. The security situation across the strait is going to become much more complicated now. And a lot is also going to depend on what is U.S. policy towards Taiwan in the next few years.
Professor Marc, how much do you think the U.S. should be worried at this moment after hearing this confirmation of Xi Jinping for his third term? Because we know that, again, numerous articles came out that Taiwan should be worried, not only because China is growing and also this military exercise and this military power empowerment, but also, meanwhile, some experts believe that it's possible that U.S. is going to distance itself from Taiwan in order to going back to this relationship between China and U.S. at this moment. So in other words, do you think that U.S. should be worried at this moment because Xi Jinping is going to continue his political or this economic strategy, and meanwhile Taiwan is also should be concerned because U.S. interest is no longer, or at least it's not really in the place of Taiwan anymore?
Well, the first point I would make is that the Xi government is getting daily reminders from Ukraine as to the danger of attempting to settle the Taiwan issue militarily in the near term. My particular thought is that what has been happening with Russia's numerous military failures in Ukraine, they seem to be pretty much adding up by the day, is that China runs the same risk of failing in any kind of military operations against the island. That said, there's still the sense you would get within the Xi government of a closing window, that if the situation, the current status quo, is allowed to linger on for too long, Taiwan will become more sovereign, Taiwan will be able to develop much stronger international support, and that peaceful unification becomes much more difficult. But we go back to the question, what is the cost-benefit analysis of the Xi government regarding Taiwan? And we simply can't answer that unless you're actually in the inner circle in Beijing.
Professor Marc, I want to bring another country into the conversation, which is North Korea. And again, that lately, the South Korean government is very anxious and quite worried about the ongoing behavior from North Korea, because so far we have seen this missile testing from North Korean government one after another. And the report came out that at this moment, South Korean government is willing to reach out to the U.S. in order to reshape up this political and also this military strategy in order to come up with some feasible or practical solutions to counter what is North Korea doing at this moment. So my first question is, why do you think that North Korea today, at this moment, has been very active in terms of missile testing and also the nuclear weapon development? And number two, how much do you think this collaboration between U.S. and South Korean government can actually become effective in order to counter what is happening in North Korea?
Yes, I would say firstly that the kind of Nordpolitik policies of Moon Jae-in, the former South Korean leader, I'd say that's truly gone at this point. So unfortunately, we're back to the bad old days of a few years ago, whereby North Korea was unilaterally taking it upon itself to essentially push its own security agenda through missile testing. Now, it is looking very possible that we might see another nuclear test between now and the end of this year. And to answer your question about timing, I would say a lot of this has to do with the fact that North Korea is still of the view that it needs to be given more attention by the international community, especially the United States. We are going to be heading into, we're already in a very interesting kind of political phase internationally, with the party Congress in China, with the midterms coming up in the United States, and with a lot of questions over what the eventual outcome of the Ukraine conflict is going to be. So North Korea is very much wanting its own concerns to still be at the top of the international agenda. We don't know, and it is very difficult to tell what the domestic situation is in Pyongyang right now. The health situation is still said to be very difficult. We don't know how stable the current government is, especially the upper tier in North Korea. And until we know a little bit more, I'd say it's pretty strong signs that we're going to be seeing North Korea continue this policy of pressure until it feels that it can get some kind of response from the United States and the West. Now, another question attached to this, though, is now that we have another Xi government, what will this do, if anything, to the current state of China-North Korea relations? Because China right now has a domestic to-do list which is very, very long, and quite frankly is also not in the mood to deal with a North Korean security crisis right now. So I wonder how much of this is tacitly supported by China, how much of it is being tolerated by China, or is this North Korea pretty much acting alone again?
Well, Professor Marc, you just sort of answered my next question is, again, in reality, since you mentioned before that China today just wrap up this congressional meeting, which is really send a strong message to the world. But meanwhile, that regarding the issue of North Korea, now again, it's safe to say that China has not put North Korea on the agenda so far. So in other words, if North Korea believes that by having this ongoing missile tests or continue this nuclear weapon development, that China can be or hopefully continue to be this big brother or this sort of this political backup to support this behavior, don't you think that North Korea government is actually placing a wrong bet? So in other words, it's playing a very dangerous game at this moment. But also meanwhile, South Korean government and current president is also very much interested in smoothing out the relationship with the Chinese government as well. Because we know that in order to manipulate or control the situation in North Korea, China has to be brought into the conversation. Now, at this moment, what do you think that North Korean government can gain if this ongoing behavior continues, or if this missile testing or nuclear weapons cannot be stopped at this moment?
Yeah. A few years back, the South Korean government was in a much better position to maintain good relations with both the United States and China, especially in regards to South Korean economic cooperation with China. This is becoming much more difficult now. We've seen very strong signs from the Chinese government that it's becoming less patient with South Korea, Japan, others getting too close to the United States. So relations between Seoul and Beijing are still very cold compared to a few years back. Also, it is pretty much understood that the current government in South Korea wants to improve relations with the United States, wants to improve especially security relations, and this is making China much more concerned. So the fact is South Korea is going to need the support of both the United States and China to deal with North Korea. It does not want to be in a situation where it's going to have to handle the situation largely alone. But there are concerns. If China does take a hands-off approach to what's happening on the peninsula, and if the United States continues to be focused primarily on Ukraine, as well as domestic political concerns coming up in the next few months, it is going to put South Korea in a very precarious position. And that's on top of the fact that, like many other parts of East Asia, South Korea is also facing some pretty heavy economic headwinds.
Professor Marc, I know your time is very busy. I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, I want to go back to China. Let's talk about the Chinese economy at this moment. Again, as we mentioned before, during this congressional meeting that Xi Jinping mentioned numerous times regarding this economic, what we called common prosperity. But we know that today, when we look at this country, constitutes 1.4 billion people, that when we have this idea, modernization or common prosperity, or even we talk about this poverty elimination program, everything seems so tangible or feasible on paper, but in reality, it is rather much more difficult for this brand new Communist Party to take on. So at this moment, going back to the word modernization, going back to the word common prosperity, how do you think that Xi Jinping is going to use his strategy or use the plans to restore his credibility, not just outside, but internally? How do you think he's going to take care of some of the critical issues? Remember, the economic slowness really has something to do with overseas investment and political disentanglement. And also, we're looking at some of the regulations and tougher policies on domestic business owners or entrepreneurs. So putting together, how do you think that he's going to woo the voters or the citizens internally?
That is the big question. Like domestically, I'd say the first issue that is going to have to be dealt with is the zero COVID policy. Now, many commentators were hoping that we'd see a sign out of this last Congress meeting that the restrictions would begin to be eased up. There is no sign of that. In fact, the zero COVID policy was praised more than once during the proceedings over the past week. This is a concern because if we don't have an endpoint and if we still see the possibility of very large numbers of Chinese citizens being locked down, this not only has obvious social ramifications, but also economic ones as well. The fact that we are seeing a much slowing Chinese economy, that China is bracing itself for a much slower growth, the fact that we are seeing a lot of global economic concerns and that China is still considered to be a major player in the global economy. The worry is that if we do see a prolonged slowdown in China, that is going to have aftershocks in many other parts of the world. And whether China will be in a position to sustain a lot of its Belt and Road projects in many parts of the world are also starting to be questioned now. The other point is that with the situation, let's say, go back about, again, 10 years or so, where there was a great deal of focus about developing China's tertiary sector, high technology, really starting to invest in kind of emerging areas like artificial intelligence, quantum computing. It was viewed that China would soon start to kind of pull ahead of the US in all of these emerging sectors. Then we have about a year ago, as I mentioned, several tech conglomerates were put under a considerable amount of pressure and restraint by the Xi government, suggesting that they were being politically kind of brought back into the fold. That leads to the worry that, okay, what is China's growth going to be based on? Is it going to be, again, manufacturing for export? Well, that's going to be very difficult under current circumstances. Or is there going to be kind of a period of slowing down and then high-tech sectors will continue again? Because it is very clear that China still views these high technology areas as a pathway of bringing China into the status of a modern economy, which it hopes to do so by about 2049. But we're dealing with a lot of contradictions here. And again, most of the decisions are now being centered on one person, Xi Jinping. So we need to find out what he's thinking now.
Professor Marc, I want to wrap up our conversation by going back to the social media platforms. And if you, I don't know if you pay attention to this or not, but one short video has been going viral across the social media platforms was regarding the predecessor of Xi Jinping, which is Hu Jintao. So during the closing ceremony, right before Xi Jinping was going to deliver his speech, Hu Jintao was unexpectedly removed before Xi Jinping was going to deliver the speech. And based on the video showing that Hu Jintao was not willing to leave the place, of course, that we did not know what actually took place at the moment, and also what he said to Xi Jinping before, and also Li Keqiang before he left. But I think this video really caught attention and also started to question, how do you think that Xi Jinping, or how should we understand Xi Jinping, is dealing with the predecessors? So in other words, do you think that Xi Jinping is trying to let people, not only in China, but also outside China, to understand this is the era of Xi Jinping? This is no longer the era of Hu Jintao or all the predecessors. What do you think he's trying to accomplish? And do you think he's trying to erase the memory of the past and in order to start a new chapter under his new ruling?
Yes, one kind of iron rule when it comes to these kinds of party Congress meetings is that everything is very meticulously choreographed. No surprises, no spontaneous anything. I would say there were two kind of images or memes which came out which kind of damaged that. One regarding Hu Jintao, which I'll talk about in a moment, but the other, the so-called Sitong Bridge incident in Haidian in Beijing, where you had a protester put up banners criticizing the zero COVID policy, criticizing the personality cult of Xi. And even though it was obviously very quickly suppressed on Chinese social media, images continue to circulate, including, for example, at American and British universities. So that certainly kind of spoiled the idea that everything was fine and wonderful. But then you have the image of Hu Jintao, who is now 79 and is showing signs of ill health, being led out under very odd circumstances during one meeting. Now, this has been interpreted in a few ways. One was the suggestion that came out through Xinhua that he was simply feeling ill and he had to be escorted out of the room. But it was done in such a very odd fashion that there has been the interpretation that this might have been done to make a political statement, to say we are no longer, like the Xi government, is no longer dependent on the goodwill of party elders, like Hu Jintao, like Jiang Zemin before him, and that Xi was his own person. Now, we'll probably never get the full story, and it's very unlikely that this will come about. But again, it really seems to suggest that trying to get an understanding of what's happening within the kind of inner sanctum of the Chinese government is becoming much more difficult.
One more question, Professor Marc. Do you believe that Xi Jinping is trying to build up the leadership for China, or he's trying to build up another dictatorship for China? I know that when we use the word dictatorship, it's rather sensitive today. But again, across the aisles, that many international experts believe by having the confirmation for the third term and by trying to eliminate all the past, for China and restart a new chapter under Xi Jinping, or this ongoing political, this social, and also the economic changes, that we're not looking at a leader for China, and China is really heading down to this political downstream at this moment. What do you say to that?
Yeah, the impression that I get, the impression that I have been getting in Chinese politics over the past few months is that it is unlikely that Xi Jinping is going to try to emulate Vladimir Putin, to kind of stay on for life and to basically try to do anything to eliminate any and all dissent. That said, though, Xi Jinping does want to put his own personal stamp on both the party and the country. And probably the main reason why he wanted to continue for a third term was that he wanted to make it very, very sure that his legacy was confirmed. Now, I would say that we have a third term. It's very possible we will see a fourth. Beyond that, things get very murky, because I think at that point, there might be the idea that Xi has said, okay, my legacy has been cemented enough, time to move it to the next generation. Because there is a so-called sixth generation of Chinese leaders who have been very, very quietly waiting for their place in the sun. So I'm talking about people in their 40s and 50s who are expecting to be much higher in the party hierarchy by now. But what concerns me is that with this third term and with such a concentration of power onto one person, the potential to view any kind of dissent or any kind of opposition or any kind of alternative viewpoint as insubordination or even a challenge to Xi's rule could bring about the totalitarian leanings that you discuss. And that is going to be obviously a very serious problem if you look at it from the economy, from politics, or from foreign and security policy. We're in very uncertain times right now.
Absolutely, Professor Marc. I 100% agree with you. We are certainly living in this uncertain period. Of course, that regarding China, now we don't know what Xi Jinping is going to do with the country and also with this political and also this economic policies. But meanwhile, it's crucial that we understand that Xi Jinping is no longer just by himself, and with all the people, with all the cabinet members, and of course, as you mentioned before, all the loyalists. And Xi Jinping is going to, again, continue to revolutionize this country in order to generate much greater noises around the world. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Professor Marc Lanteigne. Now, Professor Lanteigne teaches in political science, including international relations, comparative politics, including China, Japan and South Korea and many countries, and also regarding the security studies and the political economy. Professor Marc, thank you so much for taking your time to join the show. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and we love to have you back on the show again as we continue to pay attention what Xi and China is going to do next. Thank you, Professor Marc, for doing this.